The research station floated in the darkness of space like a silver wheel turning slowly against the stars. Nexus Prime was home to scientists and engineers from over 50 different alien species, all working together in the name of knowledge and discovery. At least that was what the official document said. The reality was much different. Jake Morrison walked through the main corridor with his toolkit hanging from his shoulder. The human engineer had been on the station for 3 months now, and he still felt the stares. Aliens of every shape and size watched him pass. Some looked curious. Most looked dismissive. A few looked disgusted. He was used to it by now. Humanity had joined the Galactic Coalition only 15 years ago, and most species still saw humans as the new kids who showed up late to the party. Worse than that, they saw humans as violent primitives who barely qualified as intelligent life. Jake did not let it bother him. He had a job to do and he did it well. When the station's systems broke down, which happened more often than anyone wanted to admit, the other engineers called him. Not because they liked him, but because he could fix things they could not. Today's call took him to the xenobiology lab in Section 7. The atmospheric regulator was malfunctioning again, and the Zendari scientist who worked there had filed an urgent repair request. Jake checked the work order on his tablet as he walked. Dr. Lyra Velshara. He had heard the name before but never met her. The lab doors opened with a soft hiss and Jake stepped inside. The room was huge, filled with strange equipment and tanks containing even stranger specimens. In the center of it all stood a tall figure with silver skin that seemed to glow softly in the lab's dim light. Lyra Velshara did not look up when he entered. She was studying something on a screen, her long white hair flowing around her shoulders like it had a mind of its own. Her violet eyes stayed focused on her work. Jake cleared his throat. Still nothing. He walked closer and said in a friendly voice that he was here to fix the regulator. Lyra waved one hand toward the far wall without looking at him. The gesture was clear. Fix it and leave. Do not bother me. Jake found the regulator and opened the access panel. The problem was obvious to him within seconds. A connection had come loose, probably from vibration. It was an easy fix, but he took his time to check everything else while he was there. As he worked, he could hear Lyra talking to someone over her communication device. She was speaking in Standard Galactic, the common language everyone used, so Jake understood every word. She was talking about humans. Specifically, she was talking about how limited they were, how their brains processed information in such simple ways, how they relied on aggression instead of intelligence to solve problems, how it was fascinating in the same way that studying insects was fascinating. Jake kept working. He had heard worse. At least she was talking to someone else and not directly insulting him to his face. When he finished the repair, he tested the system twice to make sure everything worked properly. Then he walked over to where Lyra was still absorbed in her work. He said the regulator was fixed and asked her to sign off on the work order. Lyra finally looked at him. Her violet eyes swept over him like he was one of her specimens. There was no warmth in that gaze, only cold assessment. She asked how long the repair took. Jake told her 20 minutes. Her eyebrows rose slightly. The previous engineer, a Korthan with 40 years of experience, had estimated the job would take at least 2 hours. She asked what method he used. Jake explained the problem and his solution in simple terms. He had bypassed the diagnostic loop that was causing the system to freeze and replaced the loose connection with a temporary fix until the proper parts arrived. Lyra listened with an expression that Jake could not quite read. When he finished, she said something that made his jaw tighten just a little. She said it was lucky improvisation. Humans were good at that, she explained. When you lacked the intelligence for proper planning, you had to rely on random trial and error. Sometimes it worked. Jake forced a smile and held out his tablet for her signature. He had learned not to argue with people like her. She signed without another word and he left. Over the next few weeks, Jake found himself called to Lyra's lab 3 more times. Each time she treated him the same way, like he was invisible, like he was a service machine that happened to look like a person. The worst part was the reports. Jake's friend Casey worked in the administration office and she told him about the documents Lyra was filing. The Zendari scientist was conducting a study on human behavior, and every human on the station was part of her research whether they knew it or not. Casey showed him some of the reports on her tablet one day in the commissary. Jake read through them with growing disbelief. Lyra had documented everything. how humans ate, how they socialized, how they solved problems. Every observation came with notes about how primitive or limited the behavior was. There was a whole section about him specifically. Lyra had written that Jake displayed typical human overconfidence in his technical abilities. She noted that while he sometimes achieved adequate results, his methods were crude and showed a lack of understanding of advanced principles. She concluded that he was a perfect example of how humans mimicked intelligence without truly possessing it. Casey asked if he was angry. Jake just shrugged and said, "People believed what they wanted to believe." Getting mad would not change anything, but something did change a few days later. The station held a weekly briefing where different departments presented their research findings. It was usually boring, but attendance was mandatory for senior staff. Jake sat in the back of the conference room, trying to stay awake through presentations about quantum field variations and biochemical synthesis. Then Lyra took the stage. She spoke for 30 minutes about human cognitive limitations. She showed charts and data comparing human problem solving to other species. Every comparison made humans look worse. She used words like basic, simple, and limited over and over. Her conclusion was clear. Humans lacked the mental flexibility for truly advanced work. They could follow instructions and perform basic tasks, but they would never contribute meaningfully to galactic science or culture. They were, at best, adequate manual laborers. Jake sat through the entire presentation without moving. Several other humans in the room looked angry or hurt. A few left early, but Jake stayed until the end. When Lyra finished and asked for questions, Jake raised his hand. The room went quiet. Everyone knew he had been the main subject of her human behavioral studies. He stood up and thanked her for her research. He said it was always valuable to see ourselves through other eyes. Then he sat back down. Lyra looked confused. She had clearly expected an angry outburst, some display of the human emotional volatility she had written about. Instead, Jake just smiled at her. It was not a warm smile, but it was not hostile either. It was calm, controlled, completely unlike what she expected. The presentation ended and people filed out of the conference room. Jake was almost to the door when he heard raised voices behind him. He turned to see Casey confronting Lyra in the hallway. Casey was furious. She told Lyra that her research was biased garbage, that she was too stuck up to see the truth, and that humans were worth 10 of any Zendari. Other people stopped to watch the confrontation. Lyra's face showed satisfaction rather than concern. Here it was, exactly what she had predicted. Human emotional outbursts, inability to accept criticism, primitive aggressive responses to intellectual challenges. Jake walked over and gently pulled Casey away. He told her it was not worth it. Casey wanted to keep arguing, but Jake shook his head and guided her toward the exit. As they left, Jake glanced back at Lyra. She was recording notes on her tablet, probably documenting this perfect example of human behavior. Her expression said she had won. She had proven her point. That evening, Jake needed to think. He went to Observation Deck 3, a quiet spot where few people went. The room was mostly windows, offering a view of the stars and the moon they orbited. He stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, just watching the universe turn. He thought about Lyra's presentation, about Casey's anger, about the way everyone on the station looked at humans. He heard footsteps behind him. Somehow he knew who it was before she spoke. Lyra's voice came from the doorway. She said she was surprised to find him here. She had expected him to be somewhere celebrating his restraint, telling everyone how he had controlled himself. Jake turned to face her. He said he was not celebrating anything. He was just thinking. Lyra walked closer, clearly ready to deliver another observation about human behavior. But Jake spoke first. He told her she was right about a lot of things. Humans were violent. They had spent thousands of years fighting each other over stupid reasons. They had nearly destroyed their own planet before they learned better. They were late to space, late to the galactic community, and yes, they were still learning. Lyra looked surprised that he was agreeing with her. Then Jake asked her a question. He asked if the Zendari had always been perfect, if they had never made mistakes, if they had never fought wars or struggled with their own darkness. Lyra replied coolly that her people had evolved beyond such things thousands of years ago. Jake nodded slowly. He said maybe that was the difference. The Zendari had time to smooth out all their rough edges. Human. Human aggression was actually protective instinct. Human emotional responses were empathy and connection. Human improvisation was adaptive intelligence. Everything she had dismissed as primitive was actually sophisticated in ways she had refused to see. And somewhere in the past few months, this particular human had become more than a research subject to her. She could not say exactly when it happened. Maybe it was that first conversation in the observation deck. Maybe it was watching him face prejudice with quiet dignity. Maybe it was seeing him risk everything without hesitation. Whenever it happened, the result was undeniable. She cared about Jake Morrison in a way that went beyond professional interest. The thought of him dying hurt in ways she... 3 days passed after that conversation in the observation deck. Lyra tried to focus on her work, but she found her thoughts drifting back to what Jake had said. She reviewed her research notes again and again, searching for flaws in her methodology. She found none, yet the doubt remained. On the 4th day, everything changed. Lyra was in her lab when the alarm started. Not the gentle chimes that signaled minor issues, but the harsh wailing that meant something was seriously wrong. Emergency lights flooded the corridors with red. The station's automated voice announced a critical malfunction in the power core. She rushed to the nearest information terminal and pulled up the status display. What she saw made her blood run cold. The primary power core was destabilizing. If it continued on its current trajectory, it would breach containment within 2 hours. Everyone on the station would die. All senior staff were ordered to the main conference room immediately. Lyra arrived to find chaos. Commander Voran, a massive Kralth whose species normally exuded calm authority, looked worried. Engineers from a dozen different species crowded around holographic displays, arguing about solutions. The problem was complex. A cascade of failures had locked the quantum processors in diagnostic loops. The automated systems that normally handled emergencies were paralyzed, unable to act because they could not complete their safety checks. Every attempt to override the system failed. Lyra watched as the senior engineers proposed solution after solution. Each one required complete data analysis before implementation. Each one would take too long. The clock kept counting down. Jake sat near the back of the room, listening intently. Lyra noticed him because he was the only person not arguing or panicking. He was thinking. After 20 minutes of fruitless debate, Jake stood up. His voice cut through the noise with surprising authority. He said he had a solution. The room fell silent. Commander Voran asked him to explain. Jake walked to the holographic display and pointed out the problem. The quantum processors were stuck trying to analyze a situation they were not designed to handle. His solution was simple and radical. Bypass them completely. Revert to manual controls for the core stabilization. The other engineers reacted with immediate horror. Manual controls? That was impossible. The systems were too delicate. One wrong move could make things worse. Besides, the reactor space was already flooding with deadly radiation. Anyone who went down there would receive a fatal dose within minutes. Jake acknowledged the risks calmly. He explained exactly how he would reroute the power flow and stabilize the core using the backup analog systems that every station had but no one ever used. It would work. It had to work. Commander Voran asked if anyone had a better idea. The room remained silent. The engineers knew Jake's plan might work, but none of them were willing to volunteer for what amounted to a suicide mission. The debate continued. Minutes ticked away. Jake could see they were going to talk until it was too late. He made a decision. He stood up and announced that he was going to fix it. Right now, with or without permission. Commander Voran ordered him to stop, but Jake was already moving. He walked out of the conference room at a fast pace. Security alarms sounded as he overrode safety protocols and headed for the engineering bay. Lyra found herself on her feet without knowing why. Her logical Zendari mind told her this was not her concern, but something deeper, something she did not want to examine too closely, drove her to follow him. She caught up with Jake in the engineering bay. He was pulling on a radiation suit, checking the seals with practiced efficiency. When he saw her, he looked surprised. Lyra demanded to know what he thought he was doing. Did he have any idea how reckless this was? He could die down there. Jake continued preparing his equipment. He said someone had to try. His plan was the only one on the table. If he waited any longer, everyone would die anyway. But why him, Lyra asked. Why throw away his life like this? Jake looked at her then, really looked at her. He said this was what humans did. When thinking was not enough, they acted. When the situation was impossible, they tried anyway. Maybe it was stupid. Maybe it was primitive. But it was who they were. He picked up his tools and headed for the access shaft. Lyra wanted to say something, wanted to stop him, or at least understand why this bothered her so much. But he was gone before she could find the words. She ran back to her lab and pulled up the internal sensor feeds. She found Jake's location and tracked his descent through the station's lower levels. The radiation readings climbed higher and higher as he approached the reactor core. Jake kept up a running commentary over the communication system. His voice stayed calm even as the readings showed what the radiation was doing to his body. He described each step of his plan, explaining everything in case someone else needed to finish if he failed. Lyra listened to every word. She watched the vital signs monitor show his heart rate increasing, his body temperature rising. The suit's protection was inadequate for this level of exposure. He had known that going in. Other people gathered around sensors throughout the station, watching the human engineer attempt the impossible. Even those who had mocked humans fell silent. Whatever else could be said about Jake Morrison, he had courage that went beyond reason. Jake reached the core chamber after 15 minutes that felt like hours. The manual override panel was damaged, just as he had suspected. He would have to rewire the connections by hand while radiation poured over him. He worked methodically, his engineer's training taking over. First connection, second, third. Each one brought him closer to success, but also closer to a lethal dose of radiation. Lyra found herself gripping the edge of her desk, her carefully controlled emotions spiraling into fear. This human, this primitive creature she had studied and dismissed, was dying to save a station full of people who had never shown him respect or kindness. The final connection was the hardest. The damaged panel required fine manipulation that the bulky suit gloves made impossible. Jake's voice came over the comm, matter-of-fact and calm. He said he had to remove the gloves to complete the work. Someone in the command center shouted for him to stop. Direct exposure would kill him. Jake replied that everyone would die if he did not finish. Then he pulled off the gloves. Lyra watched the radiation readings spike. She watched Jake's hands, bare and vulnerable, make the final connection. She watched the power core readings stabilize. She watched the emergency alarms fall silent. He had done it. The station was safe. Then Jake collapsed. The medical team rushed in with shielded equipment. Lyra ran from her lab toward the medical bay, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. She pushed through crowds of people, all talking about the human hero who saved them. She reached the medical bay as they were bringing Jake in. He was unconscious, his exposed hands burned and damaged. The medical staff worked frantically, hooking him up to machines that beeped and flashed with concerning patterns. A Zendari doctor that Lyra knew approached her. His expression was grave. Jake had received massive radiation exposure. They would do everything they could, but human biology was still not fully understood. The next few days would tell if he would survive. Lyra asked if she could see him. The doctor said he was unconscious and would remain that way for a while. But she could wait in the observation area if she wished. She sat down in a chair near the window overlooking Jake's medical pod. She had no logical reason to be there. She barely knew this human. He had been nothing more than a research subject to her. Yet the thought of him dying filled her with an ache she did not understand. Hours passed. Other people came and went. Casey stopped by with tears in her eyes. Commander Voron himself paid a visit, speaking quietly about Jake's heroism. The station's communication system broadcast the news. Jake Morrison, the human engineer everyone had dismissed, had saved over 1,500 lives. Lyra sat through it all, watching the medical monitors track Jake's struggling vital signs. She thought about her research, about every conclusion she had drawn about human limitations, about how wrong she had been. She had seen courage, yes, but it was more than that. She had seen someone who valued other lives more than his own safety, someone who acted when others could only debate, someone who proved that being human meant something she had never understood. Late that night, when most of the station had returned to their quarters, Lyra remained in the observation area. She pulled up her research files on her tablet and began reading through them with new eyes. Every observation now seemed shallow. Every conclusion incomplete. She had documented human behavior without understanding the reasons behind it. She had seen the surface without looking deeper. Jake spent 5 more days in the medical bay. His body was healing, but slowly. The radiation had done serious damage, and human recovery took time. The medical staff assured him he would make a full recovery, with one exception. His hands would bear permanent scars. Lyra visited him every day. At first, she told herself it was for research purposes. She needed to document human recovery patterns, but she knew she was lying to herself. Research had nothing to do with the relief she felt each time she saw him awake and alert. Their conversations were different now. The cold distance Lyra had maintained was gone, replaced by something warmer but more uncertain. She did not know how to talk to him without her research as a shield. On the 3rd day of visits, Jake asked her directly why she kept coming back. Did she need more data for her studies? Lyra found herself unable to give her usual clinical answer. She admitted that she had deleted all her research. Every file, every report, every conclusion. It was all wrong, and she could not continue work built on such flawed assumptions. Jake looked surprised. He asked what changed her mind. Lyra struggled to find words. She said watching him risk his life to save people who had shown him nothing but contempt made her realize how blind she had been. She had studied humans like specimens without seeing them as people. She had documented behaviors without understanding the values behind them. Jake was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised her. He said he never blamed her for her views. First contact was hard for everyone. Prejudice was natural when different species met. Understanding took time and effort. He added that he had seen past her cold exterior from the start. He knew she was not truly cruel, just convinced she was right. He recognized someone who was genuinely curious about the universe, even if that curiosity was filtered through cultural bias. Lyra felt something twist in her chest. He had seen more in her than she had ever seen in him. While she was busy documenting his limitations, he was recognizing her potential for growth. As the days passed, their conversations deepened. Lyra found herself sharing things she rarely discussed with anyone. She talked about the pressure of Zendari society, where intellectual achievement was everything. She described growing up knowing she had to be perfect, always correct, never showing weakness or doubt. Jake listened without judgment. He shared his own story in return. He talked about growing up in a military family where strength and duty were valued above all else. He explained how he chose engineering over combat, disappointing his father but following his own path. He spoke about humanity's history with surprising honesty. The wars, the environmental destruction, the social problems that still plagued his species. But he also talked about human art, music, and literature. He described Earth's diverse cultures and the beauty humans created despite their flaws. Lyra found herself fascinated. She had studied human behavior, but never bothered to learn about human culture. Now Jake was opening a door to a world she had dismissed as primitive. On Jake's 7th day in medical, he was cleared to leave. His hands were still bandaged, but he could return to his quarters. The medical staff scheduled follow-up appointments and gave him restrictions on physical activity. As Jake gathered his few belongings, he mentioned that he would probably be reassigned soon. Commander Voron had suggested moving him to a station with more humans, where he would face less prejudice and have better support. Lyra felt something cold grip her heart. The thought of Jake leaving Nexus Prime disturbed her far more than it should. She had no claim on him. They were barely friends. Yet the idea of the station without him felt wrong. She said nothing about these feelings. Instead, she helped him carry his things back to his quarters and said goodbye with formal politeness. But as she walked back to her own lab, she could not shake the empty feeling in her chest. That night, Lyra could not sleep. She lay in her quarters, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what was happening to her. The Zendari approached relationships with careful logic. Compatibility was assessed through formal evaluations. Courtship followed specific protocols. Everything was measured and planned. What she felt for Jake followed none of those rules. It was impulsive and illogical. It made no sense from a practical standpoint. Their species had different lifespans, incompatible cultures, and completely different approaches to life. Any relationship between them would be complicated at best and impossible at worst. Yet despite all the logical reasons to dismiss these feelings, they remained. If anything, they grew stronger the more she tried to analyze them away. Unable to rest, Lyra went to the observation deck. It had become her thinking place since that first real conversation with Jake. The stars provided perspective when her thoughts became too tangled. She stood by the windows for a long time, watching the distant lights. Then she heard familiar footsteps behind her. She turned to find Jake entering the observation deck. He looked surprised to see her. He said he had not been able to sleep either. Something about being in medical for a week had messed up his sleep schedule. They stood together by the windows in comfortable silence. After a while, Lyra found herself asking a question that had been bothering her. She asked how humans could love so easily when it made them so vulnerable to pain. Jake thought about it before answering. He said maybe that was exactly why. Human lives were short compared to most species. They did not have centuries to carefully plan perfect relationships. If they waited for the perfect moment, they would miss all the real moments. He added that yes, love made humans vulnerable. It could hurt terribly, but the alternative was living a safe, empty life without connection. Most humans would rather risk pain than miss out on something real. Lyra absorbed his words. She realized he was describing exactly what she had been struggling with. The safe, logical choice was to maintain professional distance. The dangerous, illogical choice was to admit that her feelings had grown beyond anything appropriate. Jake turned to look at her. In the soft light from the stars, his expression was gentle. He said he was going to miss her when he transferred to the other station. The words broke through Lyra's careful control. She found herself confessing more than she intended. She said she came to Nexus Prime so confident in her superiority. She arrived with theories that made her feel safe in her assumptions. Meeting him had destroyed all of that. She told him about the pressure from her colleagues, about the way other Zendari looked at her now that she no longer published anti-human research, about how her mentor had sent messages expressing concern for her mental state. But worse than all of that, she admitted, was what he had done to her carefully ordered worldview. He made her question everything she thought she knew. He made her feel things she was not supposed to feel. He made her realize that her heart did not care about logic or cultural expectations. She said the thought of him leaving made her ache in ways that terrified her. She knew it was foolish. They were from different worlds with different lives. Any relationship would be complicated and probably painful, but her heart had betrayed her completely. Jake listened to her confession without interruption. When she finished, he reached out and took her hand. His touch was gentle, careful of his healing injuries. He told her that maybe the best things in life were the illogical ones, that sometimes the heart understood things the mind refused to accept. He admitted that he had felt drawn to her almost from the beginning, even when she was studying him like a lab specimen. He saw past her cold exterior to someone who was genuinely brilliant and curious, someone who had the courage to admit when she was wrong, someone who could grow and change despite the pressure of her culture. Jake said he did not know how a relationship between them would work. The practical problems were real and significant, but he knew he did not want to leave without at least trying to find out. Lyra felt tears forming in her eyes. Zendari rarely cried, but she found she no longer cared about maintaining perfect composure. She asked what they should do. Jake smiled and said they should probably start with dinner. Something simple. Get to know each other without research projects or medical emergencies in the way. Despite her emotional turmoil, Lyra found herself laughing. It was such a human solution, face impossible complications by starting with something small and manageable. They stood together by the observation windows, hands linked, watching the stars turn. Neither of them knew what would happen next. The future was uncertain and probably difficult. But for the first time in her long life, Lyra found she did not need to have everything planned out. Over the following weeks, Jake and Lyra carefully built something new between them. They had dinner together in the commissary, enduring curious stares from other station residents. They took walks through the observation decks, talking about everything and nothing. Lyra introduced Jake to Zendari philosophy and art. She shared her favorite meditation practices and explained the principles that guided her people's long lives. Jake found them fascinating even when he disagreed with their conclusions. Jake shared human culture in return. He played music from Earth for her, everything from classical to rock. He showed her human films and explained the stories humans told themselves. He introduced her to the messy, passionate way humans approached art and life. They discovered that despite vast. The next day, Commander Voron called them both to his office. Lyra worried that he would add his own objections to their relationship. Instead, he surprised them. The commander said that Nexus Prime was meant to be a place where different species learned to work together. If they could not support two individuals who wanted to build something together, what was the point of the station? He officially recognized their relationship and offered them joint quarters if they wished. It was a small gesture but a significant one. It showed that the station administration supported them. More importantly, it gave courage to others. Within weeks, several other mixed-species couples on the station came forward publicly with their own relationships. They had been 8. News of Jake and Lyra's relationship spread through Nexus Prime faster than either of them expected. Within days, everyone on the station knew. The reactions were as varied as the species represented there. The human contingent was protective but supportive. Casey was thrilled, though she worried about the pressure Lyra would face from her own people. Other humans offered Jake advice, shared their concerns, and made sure he knew they had his back. The Zendari response was much more severe. Lyra's colleagues stopped inviting her to academic discussions. Some refused to speak to her at all. Others expressed pity that she had lost her way so completely. The worst came when her mentor, Dr. Celis, sent a formal communication requesting a private meeting. Lyra agreed, though she knew it would not be pleasant. Dr. Celis arrived at Nexus Prime 2 weeks later. He was an imposing figure even among Zendari, tall and dignified with the bearing of someone who had spent centuries in positions of authority. His silver skin had the deeper tone that came with extreme age, and his violet eyes held the weight of vast experience. They met in a private conference room. Dr. Celis wasted no time on pleasantries. He told Lyra that her behavior had become a concern for the entire Zendari academic community. Her deletion of valuable research, her abandonment of proper scientific objectivity, and now this relationship with a human had raised serious questions about her judgment. Lyra listened quietly as her mentor laid out his concerns. He spoke about her promising career, the opportunities she was throwing away, and the scandal she was creating. He talked about duty to her species and the importance of maintaining Zendari standards. Then he presented his ultimatum. If Lyra ended this inappropriate relationship and returned to the Zendari homeworld, the academic council would forgive her lapse in judgment. She could resume her career with minimal damage. Her future would still be bright. However, if she continued down this path, she would face permanent exile from Zendari academic and social circles. Her research would never be published in Zendari journals. She would be cut off from the culture and community that had shaped her entire life. Dr. Celis genuinely believed he was helping her avoid disaster. He painted a picture of her future with Jake, a few brief decades together while he aged and she remained young. Then his death and her centuries of grief and loneliness. He asked if any amount of temporary happiness was worth such pain. Lyra felt the weight of his words. Everything he said was logically sound. The lifespan problem was real. The cultural isolation would be difficult. She would be giving up everything familiar for something uncertain and probably doomed. She asked Dr. Celis for 3 days to consider his offer. He agreed, though his expression showed disappointment that she needed time at all. The correct choice should be obvious. Those 3 days were the hardest of Lyra's life. She spent hours alone, reviewing every aspect of her situation from every possible angle. She made lists of advantages and disadvantages. She calculated probabilities and projected outcomes. She tried to make the kind of rational decision her culture valued, but every logical path led to the same conclusion. Ending the relationship was the smart choice, and every time she reached that conclusion, her heart rebelled. Jake knew about the ultimatum. Casey had overheard Dr. Celis speaking to another Zendari and told him. Jake wrestled with his own doubts. Did he have the right to ask Lyra to sacrifice everything for him? Was he being selfish by even wanting her to stay? He considered requesting an immediate transfer to remove himself from the situation. If he left, Lyra could return to her old life without having to make this terrible choice. But he realized that would be just as controlling as what her people were doing. She deserved to make her own decision without anyone manipulating the circumstances. On the second night, Jake found Lyra in the observation deck. She looked tired, her normally perfect composure showing cracks. He sat beside her without saying anything at first, just offering his presence. Finally, he spoke. He told her that he loved her. It was the first time he had said those exact words. He explained that he wanted her to be happy, even if that happiness meant returning to her people and the life she had built before meeting him. He said he would not make this harder by begging her to stay or making her feel guilty for choosing her career and culture. Whatever she decided, he would respect it and understand. Lyra felt anger flash through her. She asked how he could give up so easily. Why was he not fighting for their relationship? Jake looked at her with those calm eyes that always saw more than she expected. He said he was fighting for her right to choose freely. The greatest gift he could give her was the freedom to decide without pressure or guilt. Even though the thought of losing her terrified him, Lyra realized what he was doing. He was offering her the same respect and autonomy she should have shown humans from the beginning. It was perhaps the most loving thing he could do, and it made her choice both harder and easier at the same time. On the third day, Lyra met with Dr. Sellis in the same conference room. She had not slept well, and her mind felt clearer than it had in days. She knew what she had to do, even if it terrified her. Dr. Sellis sat across from her with an expectant expression. He clearly believed she had come to her senses and would accept his offer. Lyra thanked him for his concern. She acknowledged that his points were valid and his offer generous. Then she told him she was staying with Jake. Dr. Sellis looked shocked. He demanded to know how she could throw away centuries of potential life and achievement for a relationship that would barely last decades. Lyra met his gaze steadily. She asked him a question that had been forming in her mind for days. She asked if the Zendari pursuit of longevity and perfection had actually made them happier, or if they had simply become very good at avoiding pain by avoiding life itself. She pointed out that humans, with their brief lives and imperfect natures, had learned something valuable. They loved fiercely because they knew time was limited. They took risks because playing it safe meant missing out on real experiences. They embraced pain as part of growth rather than something to be eliminated. Lyra said she had spent over a century avoiding any situation that might cause her discomfort or uncertainty. She had pursued perfect objectivity and eliminated emotional risks, and in doing so she had missed out on truly living. Jake had taught her that some things were worth the pain. That love, even temporary love, was better than eternal emptiness. That being vulnerable was not weakness but courage. She told Dr. Sellis that yes, Jake would age and die while she was still relatively young. Yes, she would grieve. Yes, it would hurt terribly. But she would have truly lived. She would have loved and been loved. She would have experienced something real instead of spending centuries in safe, sterile isolation. Dr. Sellis stood up, his face showing disappointment and anger. He told her she was making a terrible mistake. He warned that she would regret this decision when she was alone centuries from now, watching species come and go while she remained unchanged. Lyra replied quietly that maybe she would regret it. But she knew with certainty that she would regret not trying even more. Dr. Sellis left without another word. His departure meant the end of Lyra's connection to Zendari Academic Society. She had made her choice and there was no going back. Lyra sat alone in the conference room for a long time after he left. She felt the weight of what she had just done. Everything she had worked for, every connection to her culture, every plan for her future had just been erased. She should feel devastated. Instead, she felt lighter than she had in years. That evening, she went to Jake's quarters. He opened the door looking worried, clearly having spent the day anxiously waiting for news. Lyra walked into his arms without saying anything. Jake held her tightly, understanding without words what her presence meant. Finally, she spoke. She told him simply that she had chosen him, chosen them, chosen the possibility of pain over the certainty of regret. Jake pulled back to look at her face. He asked if she was sure, if she understood what she was giving up. Lyra smiled through tears. She said she had never been more certain of anything in her long life. She was terrified and excited and completely committed. They stood together in his quarters, holding each other as the reality of their decision settled over them. They knew the road ahead would be difficult. They would face continued prejudice and practical challenges. Eventually, they would face the reality of their different lifespans, but they also knew that what they had was worth fighting for. That love between beings from different worlds could bridge even the vastest distances. That choosing happiness, even temporary happiness, was better than choosing safety. 1 year after Jake and Lyra officially became partners, their life together had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Their shared quarters reflected the beautiful chaos of two cultures merging. Zendari bioluminescent plants grew in corners, casting soft light over human engineering manuals. Music from Earth played quietly while Lyra worked on her research, and Jake had learned to appreciate the harmonics of Zendari meditation sounds. Professionally, both had grown in unexpected ways. Jake had been promoted to senior engineer and now led a mixed-species team. His reputation as the human who saved Nexus Prime opened doors that had been closed before. Other species sought his technical insights, and his unconventional problem-solving approaches were now valued rather than dismissed. Lyra had redirected her research entirely. Instead of studying humans as primitive specimens, she now focused on interspecies relations and cultural integration. She used her own experience as a foundation for helping others navigate the challenges of cross-cultural connection. Her work was controversial in Zendari circles but gained attention throughout the coalition. She presented papers about the limitations of species-based prejudice and the benefits of cultural exchange. Some academics criticized her work as biased by personal involvement. Others praised her for bringing unique insider perspective to the field. Either way, people were paying attention. Daily life brought its own challenges. Cultural differences created regular misunderstandings that required patience and humor. Zendari communication included subtle psychic undertones that Jake could not perceive. He sometimes missed emotional cues that Lyra thought were obvious. Human directness could seem harsh to Lyra's more reserved sensibilities. Food remained an ongoing adventure. They learned to cook together, creating fusion dishes that surprised them both. Some experiments were disasters. Others became favorites. The process of learning each other's tastes became a metaphor for their entire relationship. Social situations could still be awkward. Some aliens viewed their relationship with curiosity or disapproval. At formal station events, they sometimes faced pointed questions or uncomfortable silence. But they also found unexpected allies. Other species who had their own mixed relationships reached out in solidarity. Casey became one of their strongest supporters. She organized informal gatherings for mixed-species couples, creating a support network where people could share experiences and advice. What started as a few couples meeting in the commissary grew into a regular community event. One evening, as they prepared dinner together in their quarters, Jake began acting strangely. He seemed nervous, dropping utensils and losing his train of thought mid-sentence. Lyra asked if something was wrong. Jake said he had been thinking about something for weeks. He explained that humans had a tradition of formal partnership called marriage, but he knew that might not translate well to Zendari culture, which had different bonding ceremonies. He said he did not want to impose human customs on her. Instead, he wanted to create something entirely new, something that belonged to both of them and honored both their traditions. Jake pulled out a small box and opened it. Inside was a ring, simple and elegant, with a design that incorporated both human and Zendari elements. Beside it was a crystal, specially grown to resonate with both their biological frequencies. He explained that the ring was a human symbol of commitment. The crystal was adapted from Zendari bonding traditions. Neither was perfect, just like their relationship. But together, they represented something unique. Jake asked if Lyra would bond with him, using whatever ceremony they created together. Lyra felt tears forming, something that still surprised her even after months of allowing herself to feel openly. She took the ring and the crystal, holding them carefully. She said yes without hesitation. They spent the following weeks planning their ceremony. It became a collaboration that reflected everything they had learned about each other. They combined elements from both traditions, added new ideas, and created something that was entirely theirs. The bonding ceremony took place in the observation deck where they had first truly connected. Commander Voron agreed to officiate, speaking about unity and the courage required to bridge different worlds. Representatives from dozens of species attended, filling the space with a rainbow of beings. Casey stood as Jake's witness, wearing formal human attire and beaming with pride. Lyra surprised everyone by choosing Nina Harper, a young human scientist, as her witness. The gesture symbolized Lyra's full acceptance of both cultures as part of her life now. They exchanged vows in both languages. Jake struggled admirably with Zendari pronunciation, making Lyra smile through her tears. Lyra spoke her human vows with careful precision, each word weighted with meaning. They shared food from both worlds. Human music played alongside Zendari harmonic resonance. The ceremony was chaotic and beautiful and completely unique. Many attendees said it was the most moving bonding they had ever witnessed. Most significantly, several other mixed-species couples attended openly for the first time. Jake and Lyra's courage had given others permission to stop hiding their own relationships. The ceremony felt like a turning point not just for them but for the entire station's culture. Months after the ceremony, Lyra received an unexpected communication. The message was from Dr. Sellis, her former mentor. She stared at his name on the screen for a long time before opening it. The message was brief and carefully worded. Dr. Sellis did not apologize directly, but he acknowledged that perhaps he had been too hasty in his judgment. He admitted that watching from a distance, he could see that Lyra seemed genuinely happy. He wondered if there might be wisdom in her choice that he had failed to recognize. He did not ask to renew their relationship, but the gesture of reaching out spoke volumes. It was a crack in the wall between Lyra and her former life. Lyra showed the message to Jake. They discussed it together, weighing whether to respond and how. Eventually, Lyra sent a carefully composed reply. She thanked Dr. Sellis for his teachings, acknowledged their disagreement remained, but expressed hope that understanding might grow with time. It was a small opening, but it was enough. Perhaps someday bridges could be built even to places that seem permanently closed. The question of lifespan still hung over them, unspoken, but always present. Jake would age faster than Lyra. Eventually, she would face loss that he would not experience. They had discussed this reality during quiet moments, agreeing that the time they had was worth the eventual pain. Lyra had secretly begun researching human life extension technologies. She did not tell Jake the depth of her investigation, not wanting to give false hope, but she studied every paper, contacted researchers, and explored every possibility. If there was a way to give them more time together, she would find it. Jake knew about her research anyway. He found the hidden files one day by accident. Instead of being upset, he felt his love for her deepen. She was fighting for their future in the only way she could, using her scientific mind to battle against biology itself. Their story spread beyond Nexus Prime. News of the human engineer and the Zendari scientist became known throughout the coalition. Some species viewed it as a romantic tale. Others saw it as a cautionary warning. But all acknowledged its significance. Human government officials on Earth received reports about their representatives making such strong impressions in the galaxy. Jake received offers to return for publicity tours, but he declined. His life was on Nexus Prime now, with Lyra and the community they were building together. Other young humans, inspired by Jake's example, volunteered for off-world assignments. They were no longer content to accept prejudice quietly. They worked to prove humanity's worth through action and character. A new generation of human ambassadors was emerging, shaped by one engineer who refused to be defined by others' limitations. 3 years after their first contentious meeting, Jake and Lyra received an unexpected honor. The coalition announced the creation of the Interspecies Relations Institute, and they were invited to serve as joint directors. The institute would be headquartered on Nexus Prime. Its mission was to help newly contacted species integrate into galactic society and assist established species in overcoming their own prejudices. Jake and Lyra would lead this work, using their experience to guide others. They accepted the position together. It felt right, like everything in their relationship had been leading to this. They would take the lessons they learned, the pain and joy of their journey, and use it to help others find their own paths. The institute grew quickly. Young beings from dozens of species came to learn. Jake taught engineering classes that emphasized diverse problem-solving approaches. Lyra lectured on the dangers of cultural superiority and the importance of emotional intelligence alongside intellectual achievement. They became mentors to many students, including several who were in their own cross-cultural relationships. The station that once barely tolerated a single human engineer now hosted regular symposiums on interspecies cooperation. Jake and Lyra were living proof that such cooperation was not just possible but beautiful. One evening, years after it all began, they returned to the observation deck. It had become their place, the spot where so many important moments had happened. They stood by the windows holding hands and watching the stars.